And now we come to episode 6, the sixth installment of the story of Sandy Point, a production of the Sandy Point Heritage Society, a self-help non-profit organization aimed at researching, documenting, and preserving the history/story of Sandy Point for posterity. Today we feature a lady who needs very little or no introduction to the people of St. Kitts and Nevis, at home and throughout the SKN diaspora. She is Mrs. Sylvia Mills, widow of the late Mr. Charles E. Mills, former educator and Minister of Government in the Robert Bratcher's administration, and after whom the Sandy Point High School has been renamed. Mr. Sylvia Mills has been an educator for most of her life, and though not born in Sandy Point, has made an invaluable contribution to the development and upliftment of not only Sandy Point but to the entire Federation and farther afield. During this interview, she's been ably assisted by her proud and loving son, Mr. Charles Mills Jr., who, by the way, is also a member of the Sandy Point Benevolent Society and the Sandy Point Heritage Society. We wholeheartedly thank the Mills family for their contribution to the story of Sandy Point. Here now is teacher Miss Mills in her own words. So you've been an educator for roughly up until your retirement, how many years?
I started education in the year 1940.
1940. Tremendous. And from go ahead, sorry.
And from 1940, I have lived in Sandy Point, except when I had to travel, probably for education purposes or maybe for vacation. But most of my life I have spent in Sandy Point. And as you speak about Sandy Point, when we talk about Sandy Point and heritage, the heritage began since in the days of the Church of England and other missionaries who came to St. Kitts. They were the people who brought education here. The churches.
Was the Methodist Church one of those?
The Methodist Church and the Anglican Church. It was the Anglican Church in those days was referred to as the Church of England. Their missionaries, their ministers, their priests, they came to St. Kitts, Sandy Point, as we have here, St. Anne's Church, and near St. Anne's Church we have St. Anne's has a parish hall. Every church had a parish hall because the missionaries were the ones who brought education here into this country.
So they were the first school hall, so to speak.
The school hall, the schools, the churches.
The churches.
And you'll notice in every church in St. Kitts on the whole, there is a parish hall, because they were the ones who started education in this country, and we must give them praise for that.
I recall many of the events we attended at the school hall there across from the Isaacs. But you know the origins of it. You made it clear to me that all the churches had that. We see things, but we don't really know. And that's why we need a person like you to educate us once again as to what happened with the education system. But the missionaries would have brought the education. You said the Anglican Church was first named the Church of England, was it?
They were called generally.
Generally. Well, let me stay quiet and please continue with the education system when you got into it and how it was.
The Methodists also had a school. You notice at the Methodist Church there's a school hall just across the street.
That is true.
So the churches who were the ones who brought education to this country. The whole island, every parish church has a hall. So that education started long ago. Well, I don't remember the years. I don't know the years because my mother went to a church school. She always spoke about going to a church school. The Methodists went to the Methodist church school, and the Anglicans, that as they are now called, went to the Anglican church school. They were the missionaries who began these schools.
Okay, the French would have come sometime after. Are you able to identify any of the mission hall with the Anglican Church, with the Roman Catholic Church?
They were English.
They were English?
They were mainly English.
But the churches then were mainly English?
The church, they came from England. Methodists and they were Anglican. In those days, they were referred to as the Church of England.
Okay.
So when people talked about going to school, in those days, they went to either the church school or the chapel school.
But here in Sandy Point, the Roman Catholic Church didn't have that establishment.
When I got to know the Roman Catholic Church, they were situated at Seabreeze, Sandy Point. That was where the Roman Catholic was.
Mr. Farrier said that. He said that the Rosados told you that that was the first Catholic church in Sandy Point, in St. Kitts actually. That one at Seabreeze. So that's corroboration.
Yeah.
So your mother went to the same school system, the church and
school.
the parochial school.
My mother and father.
And father.
Then the government took over the schools. The government took over the schools. And when the government took over the schools in Sandy Point here, those schools were boys' school and a girls' school. You might have heard about the boys' school.
I attended a boys' school, but help me out here. I was told by someone that this boys' school was the first government school in St. Kitts. The first one that took over. Is that correct?
Mainly for boys. Only boys went to that school. And the girls went to the girls' school, which is the Anglican school down there. So there were boys' school and a girls' school. The government had those schools. When they had these schools, the schools were divided. They had what we call standard, junior standard, standard 1, standard 2, standard 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And when you got to 7th standard, that was the highest level of education. So that you got your standard 7 certificate. When you got your standard 7 certificate, it was then like having your, what you call them here?
College degree?
College degree, yes. That was the highest, standard 7. Then the schools, in the schools we had teachers. The teachers, you had what we call pupil teachers. And these pupil teachers were taught by the head teacher. You had the first year pupil teacher, the second year, the third year. And then after the third year and you passed your exam, you became what we call an assistant teacher. The education of the pupil teacher was all in the hand of the head teacher.
The head teachers.
Every year they had to sit an exam. You were given 2 chances. If you failed the first year, you sat again, then you cannot be a teacher anymore. If you passed, you went on to the second year, and then you went on to the third year. You got to be a pupil teacher if you pass your standard 7 certificate exam.
Generally, what was the age range at the time?
Maybe up to 16 or so.
Up to 16?
Around that age, yes.
Okay.
My husband was 13 years when he became 13,
13.
when he became a pupil teacher, because at 13 years he had passed his standard 7 certificate examination.
Amazing, because I was speaking to another educator, teacher, Anne Raymond, and she told me that she had passed hers around 15, but she had to wait until she was 16 to be able to teach. But he passed at 13.
At 13. Well, it was unusual because in those days, according to your ability, you were able to skip classes. So although there were 7 standard, you can, this year might say you did so everywhere, you can move from 1st standard to 3rd standard. So you can skip classes according to your ability. But at 13 years, my husband became a pupil teacher under the late, what's his name, James Hanley. He was a Hanley.
A very popular name from Nevis.
J. Shandy from Nevis, yes. He taught the boys' school. He went to the boys' school here.
That is the reputation I go into. Mr. Hanley, this strict disciplinarian, he had that reputation from all the persons who I grew up hearing about Mr. Hanley. Of course, that was before my time. But when your husband would have passed his examination at age 13, did you know him then?
No, I didn't know him.
You didn't know him then? Okay. Because you became an educator around what age? Around 15, 16? Or your student?
Because I went to the girls' high school, and when I left school, having passed they had what you call a school certificate in those days, I opted to go into teaching. And that was it was during the war days, 1939, 40, around that time. Yes, I became a teacher.
What was the environment like back then in the education system? What I mean is the conditions of the schools, having transitioned from the parochial school, the school halls from church to government. What was it like, that transition?
Well, at that time, government provided everything. I could recall going to school and they had what you call a reading sheet. There were no books. In the junior standard,
No books?
they had the junior standard, which was a 5-year-old beginners, they had a big sheet which they used to throw over the backboard. And I could remember reading from that sheet. We used to read it by heart.
Wow.
The fat cat sat on the mat. Yes, I could remember. And then there were like, then the next sheet might have words ending with Anna, A-N or so forth. But we used to read it, but we read it by heart. But the schools were supplied with reading books. Those were the only set of textbooks that the schools had in those days. Then the first one I remember was one called the Nelson West Indian Reader.
I remember that.
And they had the Nelson, the first book, introductory book. You read? I cut my meat with a knife and I hold it with a fork. I can stir it with a spoon. What is in that bottle? I think there is milk in it. That I could remember that first part of the reading book.
I'll have to edit out that. So if you don't mind starting off this gone, go back to cut my thing because that's important. You speak to your recall. Okay, I can edit all that. But continue for me, please.
Yes, the reading book. After the reading sheet, we got to this book, the Nelson West Indian Reader, and I could recall the first page of that book. I cut my meat with a knife and I hold it with a fork. I can stir my tea with a spoon. What is in that bottle? I think there is milk in it. That was the first page of the Nelson introductory reader, it was called. And every class, then you went to the book 1, book 2, book 3, until you got to the one for standard 7. Those were all the textbooks owned by a class in those days, the readers.
You were saying this was around 1940 something when...
No, that was in the years when I was 5 years old and all that, when I went to school. When you went to, and it happened it was the same that happened throughout the island. Was one thing, everybody had the same set of readers, supplied by the government. And then the maths, the arithmetic as we called it then, it was reading, writing and arithmetic. The arithmetic as we call it then, those were put on the blackboard. And you could remember, we had to learn the tables, the multiplication tables. And from the twice times table to the 12 times table. And you had to learn to count from 1 to 100. We had no books for that. The teacher put whatever they had on the blackboard.
How was the discipline?
Well, as soon as children behave the same way. The children today are not much. The children long ago behaved the same way, but they had a different control.
Like that.
Children are the same all over, but only that the teachers in those days were more respected. And we looked up to the teacher. Sometimes, to tell you the truth, when you see a teacher passing, you used to hide from teacher. So
I can relate to that, but I want to hear it from your words and your perspective, because I grew into that system. I grew into, and also one of my brothers, Malcolm Morgan. He was a prefect. I wanted in the school, and over the weekend period, he and his buddies were walking through Sandy Point, and one had a cigarette. They didn't see that the headmaster had seen it. And the Monday morning, going back to school, he called them up in front, and they all got the strokes. He wasn't smoking, but you are the prefects, and you have to set the example. So that standard was throughout. I heard those stories, but hearing it from you, as a student, and later on as educator, is important to document.
Yes.
Do you ever get strokes when you go to school?
Not many, not. I probably, if you were with people, that is what the same thing, if you were in a company of people who did anything wrong, they thought that you should know better, and I didn't get many strokes. No.
So what ultimately inspired you to be a teacher?
Well, when I left school, there was you can only be, you can do three things. You can be a policeman, maybe a nurse, which is okay, a teacher, or work in the sugar industry. There was no choice. Well, I went to the high school, so when I left school, I was taken into the teaching profession. In those days when I left school, they were looking for teachers and qualified teachers. I did not have but although I had my school certificate, I still had to do the principles and practice of teaching to be qualified as a teacher.
What year was that?
1940s. I went into teaching, and then I sat my principles and practice of teaching examination. Then is when you became a qualified teacher. And afterwards I was sent to Spring Gardens in Antigua, to the training college. There was no training.
Okay.
In Antigua, yes. Very few people got a chance to go to college, because to go to college in Antigua you had to pay, which we could not afford. But the government would send people there on scholarships according to your ability.
So you excelled, and so you got a scholarship to go to Antigua.
To Antigua, yes.
How long did that term last?
Well, college in was only 2 years.
2 years?
You had to live there. You lived in Antigua. Government paid for your board and your school and everything. You traveled when they had vacation, you just came back home and you had to go back up. You had to pay for your own passage and everything to go back if you had to come home.
Really?
Yeah.
So the government rule was to get you there. If you wanted to come home for vacation and go back, that was on you?
It was on you, yes. You go by boat. You used to travel by boat. Planes weren't so prevalent then. And you had to take everything with you. You had to take your bed to sleep on.
You had to take your bed from St. Kitts?
There was the college, the only teachers' college in Antigua, Spring Gardens Training College. You had to take your bed, your everything, your cups, your whatever you're going to eat from it. You had to take them with you.
Interesting.
It was a Moravian college, belonged to the Moravian church in Antigua, Spring Gardens. So it was not really easy, but since you wanted the qualification, you had to try and do what you had to do. So that is it. So I went to the college, and when I came out, I became a trained teacher. And it was very, the schools in those days, I should also talk about the furniture too. Because in those days, we sat on long benches. Today you have, each child has a desk today.
Desk and table. I would recall when desks first came to the high school, when it was built. That's a different story, but I recall the long benches and the big wooden desks.
Yes.
And at the end of each school season, we had to scrub them, clean the rooms and all the stuff.
Yes.
So I got a little taste of that. So you would have come from an early period where the classroom would have been more stacked.
Yes, benches mostly. You only got to use a desk when you got to 4th standard. The other classes were just benches, because then we used slates.
I was going to come to that.
They used to write on slates. Slates and pencils, so there was no need for a desk. You had your slate. The slates were provided by the government too. You wrote on slate and you had your slate and a pencil. And then after you got a little, I think it was in 3rd standard, so you started to use book. And you know what, the mother used to cut the book in two, cut a whole book in half, and you get half and the sister get the other half, and you had your pencil, right? But we worked. That was in those days. Taught you handwriting, the blackboard. Teacher wrote on the blackboard and show you how to write your name and the letters, etc.
So you were actually the building blocks of society, because the thinking was to prepare the next generation to get away from the plantocracy. You educate your kids to make sure that the next level of the population would not be dependent. As you indicated, upon leaving school, the job field was very limited.
Yes.
You could be working in the sugar industry, the police service, maybe the nursing or teaching. We have the families who depended on the extra jobs, the fishermen, those who were farmers, who we call mountain men, etc. But for the emerging society, teaching was the profession where a lot of people use as a platform to elevate themselves, but you're actually building the society.
How did you get to school when you were going to school in Bath?
In
Girls High School?
Well, in those days, buses, they had what we call trucks.
I recall the trucks.
Remember Mr. Mack truck?
I recall Mr. Mack. Mr. Phipps came later on. He's one of those guys. But let me introduce, I would have mentioned your son, Charles Mills Jr. He's here with us. That was the voice you just heard asking his mother question. He too will have a lot to contribute to this interview. But yes, that's Charles Mills asking his mother about the mode of transportation back then. How you got to school, according to where you were teaching, and what was it feel like? The weekly fares for the bus, or the trucks, sorry.
You asked how we got to school. I was thinking of the high school in those days. But when it came to ordinary, in Sandy Point, you just walk to school.
That is true. But as a teacher, if you were assigned to a different village or town back then, because we walked to school with your barefoot and your slate in your hand, and later on when you had your book wrap up in your pocket. But yes.
When I began to teach, first I had to teach. I taught at a school called Bethel, that is at Parsons Ground. And I lived then in St. Paul's. There were no buses, no transportation going in that direction. All the transportation came via Sandy Point, where they traveled in the morning and they did not come back until late in the evening. So if you had one little business to do in Bastille, you had to stay all day because the trucks are not running, buses are not running. The trucks, they were not buses, they were called trucks. You had to stay all day. So I had to walk from St. Paul's to Bethel every morning, walking through a long road called White Gate. Sometimes when I'm in the middle of White Gate and I look back, I saw nobody.
Cane field on either side?
Cane field on both sides, yes.
That's a long trek.
Yes.
I drive it, that is long.
Yes, and I went to school every morning. I had to be there.
On time?
On time, because you had to sign in when you got there.
When you arrived.
And school, you had to be there at that time you had to be there by 8:45. So I would leave home early, and I always make sure I got there by 8:30.
Walking?
Walking. If it rained, I had a raincoat, a plastic raincoat, I remember. I would throw it over my shoulder and stand. They had some cedar trees, and stand under the trees until the rain.
But still managed to get there on time?
Had to get there on time.
But even when you were in high school, how did you get to school in Bath?
When I got to school in Bath, I had to travel by truck. The trucks left, the truck started in the morning, picking up cargo and things from the different shops. And if it left at maybe about 7 o'clock, and it traveled along, picking up passengers along the road. And I had to stay in Bastia all week until the Friday afternoon come home, the Friday afternoon. Because when the trucks, for me to be early for school, if the trucks left down here, well, sometimes we got there a little late, about 9 o'clock on Monday mornings. And then I came back home on Friday afternoons on the truck.
Really?
Yes. We are one of every day. The person who introduced this midday traffic from this side of the island was a man from Old Road named Mr. Ed Mead. He was the first man who started traveling midday. So if you went to town in the morning, you can catch Mr. Ed Mead's truck midday to come back home.
What time frame was this? About what year? Because I've never heard this aspect of it.
This was around maybe the 1940s. 1940s. Because yes, around the 1940s. I don't know exactly, maybe 1940s, but Mr. Ed Mead, he was the first man who started running mid-depth trips to Bastia.
Obviously, Mrs. Mills have much to share with us. We will pause at this point, but episodes 7 and 8 will feature more of the intriguing story of Mrs. Cyril Mills and her contribution to the story of Sandy Point.